Okay, so firstly, hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining us at today's webinar. This is our second webinar in the seminar series organised by the Biogeosciences Early Career Scientist Board. If you'd like to keep up to date with our upcoming webinars, then please join our mailing list, which you can do on your EGU account or keep an eye on our LinkedIn and Blue Sky accounts. So today we have Ana Bastos talking about mental health and just some housekeeping, just so you know, this session is going to be recorded and we're going to be using the Q&A box at the bottom for any questions. So yeah, other than that, over to you, Anna.
Thanks again for the invitation to talk about this topic. I had to think a lot about what exactly I would like to bring to discuss here. And so I decided to go a bit kind of through my own story of dealing with mental health or mental illness as an academic. And so going from individual struggles to then trying to bring institutional change. And I will be talking a little bit about things like how can we raise awareness, supporting self-advocacy, and ultimately promoting inclusive research environments. So I would like to first start with a disclaimer. I'm a biogeoscientist, so I'm not a mental health professional. So this talk is based essentially on my own lived experience as a neurodivergent, autistic ADHD scientist that, with a history of depression, burnout, anxiety, insomnia, and a number of other conditions. And all the things that I will be saying here are, of course, based on my experience. And in doubt, always seek professional support. And maybe also one kind of not warning, but, just this is a sensitive topic, and we will be talking about emotions and we will be talking about challenges. So if at any point you feel triggered or overflown with different types of emotions that you feel you cannot handle, feel free to mute whatever I will be saying, or even take some time off and then rejoin again if you want. Or this will be online later, so just also kind of feel free to drop out if at some point this is too much. Hopefully not. So I would like to start with talking a little bit about the science of the mental health crisis in academia. And I will start with some numbers that, have been collected by people that actually research this topic. And one of the papers that I think really influenced me also to start to become aware of this issue was this paper from 2018, where there was a broad questionnaire of graduate students in the UK across all science fields, where it was essentially seen that graduate students were more than 6 times as likely to experience depression and anxiety compared to the general population. And so we see anxiety rates 41%, depression rates 39%. This is almost 1 in 2 people that we meet in our day-to-day life. So it is quite a lot. Another relevant statistics in this context is that it's not just individual aspects. So, for example, in the same study, then the authors looked at how the prevalence rates depend on graduate students perceiving their environment to be unhealthy, so to have an unhealthy work-life balance compared to a healthy work-life balance. And then you can see that the prevalence rates of both anxiety and depression are about double in the groups where work-life balance is perceived as unhealthy, to those that perceive their, work-life balance as relatively okay. So there is already something that tells us that there are some institutional aspects that need to be considered. And then another relevant statistics in this study is how the prevalence of both conditions depend on gender. And I'm showing here for depression, but it's very similar for anxiety, where male students tend to have lower prevalence rates of both conditions compared to female, and transgender groups having kind of comparatively much higher prevalence rates of both depression and anxiety, right? So this also tells us something about not just the institutions, but also the fact that there's some diversity dimension to this problem. Now, this was a study across all scientific domains, and there's not a lot of information on specifically the geosciences. But for example, there's this paper from a few years ago where there was, again, a questionnaire across marine scientists. And essentially, the numbers are very similar, right? So most respondents experienced anxiety, so almost 67%, 50% burnout, almost 48% depression, panic attacks, almost 38%, and so on, right? So this is something that is not absent from our scientific domain. And I do think there is a crisis, and we can talk a little bit more. We will be talking a little bit more today about what can we do about this crisis. I will be briefly talking, or once in a while, I will be talking about neurodivergence. And I just wanted to introduce the concept because maybe not all of you are familiar with the topic. So just like we talk about biodiversity around us, right? So different individuals of a given species have differences in their traits. For example, in our field, trees having, for example, different specific leaf area and other functional traits. Humans also have a diversity in the way that their neurological systems work. So the way we perceive the world, the way we communicate, the way we function. And it is estimated that about 15 to 20% of the population has a source of neurodivergence, which means that they depart from the dominant social standards of what it is to communicate normally, what it is to function normally, and so on. And so neurodivergence includes a number of different conditions that can be developmental, for example, autism, ADHD, Tourette, and so on, but it can also be acquired, for example, depression and anxiety. And so the idea is that people with these conditions will be functioning in some way in a way that is different from the norms and from the societal expectations. And this actually places a big burden on these groups, right? Because there is this pressure to perform in a way that is possibly not coming out naturally. And so there's many studies that show that neurodivergent groups, so for example, in this case, there's a study comparing autistic and ADHD with non-autistic and non-ADHD. And again, we see that the prevalence of conditions like depression and anxiety are much higher for autistic and ADHD groups. Now, there's no study that I know about that focuses on neurodivergent scientists, but we can extrapolate, given the prevalence rates that I mentioned, in the general population of graduate students. We can then also think about what this might mean for neurodivergent graduate students and scientists. Now, so today I would like to start going from this individual level, where I will be talking a little bit about the basics of mental health and mental illness, and also individual perspective on going from stigma to empowerment. And then I will be talking more about kind of more collective levels relating to supporting self-advocacy and promoting inclusion, which is essentially the only way that we can actually drive long-lasting changes in our community. So let's start by looking at some basic concepts to make sure that we're all on the same page. Mental health distress can take many forms, and this is something that I realize I was not aware of when I started having problems, and it's something that I realized not a lot of people are aware. So signs of distress or severe stress can take physical form, for example, pains, heart racing, but for example, skin problems or low energy or becoming ill very frequently or much more frequently than the usual. They can also take mental, kind of emotional, or cognitive forms. So things like having difficulty focusing or our cognitive functions becoming partly impaired, losing interest in things that we normally would enjoy, having mood swings, starting to worry a lot about everything, being easily irritated or angry. So all these things can be a sign of stress and potentially something kind of more severe. Behavioral changes can also be indicators. For example, changes in sleeping patterns, either sleeping too little or sleeping too much, eating patterns, eating too little or too much, or more or less than the usual, having difficulty coping with responsibilities or isolation, or also risky or violent behavior. For example, having starting using substances to essentially cope with the stress. So the important thing to think about is that each person will have a different way in which these signs are expressed, and these signs are kind of an umbrella for many different conditions. And also some of these signs might have a physical origin. And so again, in this case, it's always very important to consult a psychological health professional that can help to try to figure out if some of these issues have physical origin or if they have essentially mental origin. And even for the same person, these symptoms can change over time. So the way anxiety has expressed for me over time has had many forms, going from eczema to panic attacks, and during my life, it's changed. For example, anxiety, there's a number of things that we can watch out for. So physical symptoms include headaches, frequent headaches, chest pain, breathlessness, heart racing, or hands shaking, lightheadedness or dizziness, sweating, feeling hot, or also like numbness in, for example, our fingers or in our feet. And so here is helpful to think about, when you're anxious, where do you normally feel it? Because everyone is anxious once in a while. For example, we have a PhD defense, or we have an exam. So we will be normally anxious for these specific events. And so learning how anxiety expresses itself is a very useful thing to learn, because then we can be more aware when anxiety starts expressing itself in situations that normally would not require us to be this stressed. Other things that can happen with anxiety, our mental abilities might be changed. So we can be very tense or not able to relax, constantly worrying about things, or having obsessive, intrusive thoughts, having difficulty concentrating, or problems sleeping. But then also the way we feel might also be a sign of anxiety. So for example, being afraid of things very often, being very prone to cry kind of easily, or feeling sad for a long period. And then behavioral signs could be things like struggling with self-care, for example, having trouble going grocery shopping, organizing dinner, taking a shower, going to work, avoiding situations or places. So having, avoiding situations that might cause anxiety. And so starting to kind of limit the range of things that we do in our life, which can also lead to social withdrawal. If, for example, some of the stressors have to do with meeting other people, difficulties keeping relationships, having compulsive behavior, being very irritable, or having outbursts. So there's a number of signs that we can pay attention to that can tell us that maybe something is developing. And I know this is a big list, and it's only for anxiety. I will not have this for all other relevant conditions, but there's a lot of material online, and I can also maybe share some links afterwards if this is relevant for us to kind of pay attention to. Now, an important thing that I've learned, I had my first depression when I was 16, and since then I've kind of managed to have a good view how these more serious mental health problems develop over time. So we can think about stage one, where we will have kind of normal ups and downs. Everybody gets anxious once in a while. Everybody gets sad or deeply sad once in a while if a family member dies, or if we fail a course. So it's there's normal life events that can make us feel kind of negative feelings, and they're a normal reaction to the environment. And so in this stage, there's also no significant impact on life activities, and generally we can cope with these situations. In stage two, we might start to see some of these warning signs that I mentioned. Some of our life activities might already be interfered with. For example, that we stop hanging out with friends, or that we avoid going to work. But it might still be hard to identify what exactly might be going on, and to some extent, it might be manageable, so that we can keep doing things more or less as we did before. Then at some point, our symptoms might start to become more frequent or more severe, so that many or several aspects of our life become severely disrupted. For example, we really stop talking with our friends, or we avoid family relationships, and so on. And here is where possibly we might still be able to manage on our own, but it might already start to be a little bit hard. And then the stage 4, where I've only been once, I would say. So I was for 1 year, about 1 year at home with persistent severe symptoms of depression and anxiety in that case. And essentially all our life activities, or most of our life activities, are impacted by this problem. And even basic functions might be very hard to maintain, to feed ourselves, to brush our teeth, to get out of bed. It might be really, really hard to get out of bed. And at this stage, it might be possibly very, very hard to manage to get out of this stage without external help. But also what I've learned after being in all of these stages several times in my life is that recovery is, of course, much harder once we hit the later stages, but it is possible. And there's things that we can do depending on which stage that we are that help us to prevent from essentially slipping to the next one, or even going back to the previous one. And so now the way I try to kind of pay attention to my mental health is to start looking for these red flags, these symptoms that I mentioned, and then that help me to know at which stage I might be. And so in stage 1, what we can do the best to prevent a mental health problem is to do prevention and self-care. I have a slide on this afterwards. In stage 2, we might want to adjust some of our life or work conditions. For example, maybe we're living in a too stressful environment, or our job environment is also stressful, and we might need some adjustments and so on. At stage 3, this is where I put already like many red flags, is where I already see that, okay, I need to probably see the doctor and get professional support and engage in therapy to prevent getting, further. And kind of bigger accommodations need probably to be implemented both in kind of private life and in the workplace. And then when reaching stage 4, again, this is a stage where everything is incredibly hard to manage. And so probably emergency services are the best way to try to get help. And sometimes we might even need someone else, for example, to go with us to the doctor, because we might not be able to communicate our struggles anymore, or we might not have the energy to organize a phone call to go to the doctor. And so I wanted actually to have a slide on resources, but of course this is an international setting, so it's hard to have a slide with all the numbers that you can call. But in every country, there are phone numbers for mental health crisis. There's emergency services at the hospitals and so on. So, maybe as a preventive measure, try to search for which, are the structures that you have around you that could help you in case you reach any of these later stages. Now, I will talk a little bit about prevention and self-care, because I think that's kind of where we have to start before we kind of go down to any of the other stages. And so there's many things that we can do to help to reduce stress and essentially promote our well-being. And so one of the things that I find that helped me the most was to start to think and talk about my feelings. But then there's other things that we can do, for example, having healthy food habits, making sure that we take rest, and that we also have a sleep hygiene that helps us to sleep in the best way that we can. Staying active, there's also studies that show that, doing sports, having hobbies, being physically active helps to increase well-being. Staying connected with others, and also asking for help when needing. But one of the things that for me sometimes is a bit difficult when it comes to prevention and self-care is that for me, as an autistic ADHDer, even knowing what my feelings are was incredibly hard for many decades. I did not have words to put to my feelings. I only knew that I was feeling stressed or that I was feeling uncomfortable, but I did not know if I was angry or if I was irritated, or if I was sad, and even now is sometimes a bit hard to know, or organizing healthy food and so on. So many of these things are extremely hard for neurodivergent people, so that staying in this stage one already requires quite a lot of effort, and it makes it very, very hard to remain balanced when there's other stressors around us. And that's the problem, I think, with academia, is that in academic environments, even prevention is not really easy, because we have a career that is built on precarious positions, mobility requirements, often also international mobility requirements. We have what is perceived as a very competitive environment, the pressure to be productive, this publish or perish. And then we also have environments where some groups are clearly underrepresented. So we have, groups that also kind of have this feeling of being imposters. And it's also an environment where there's huge power imbalances between, professors and graduate students. So the access to power is very different between these groups. And so these characteristics of the current academic environment make it, so these are things that I perceived myself, and maybe there's many other points that we could add here. But so, for example, for me, this was very hard. This precarious careers and mobility requirements make it very hard to maintain relationships, because the turnover is just so fast. You move to a new place, and even if you have a long contract, long being probably 3 years, which is not long at all to build relationships, other people will also be rotating. So you're always meeting new people and having this effort to build new relationships, which also results in a lack of support networks, right? Like kind of this group of friends that you can talk with when you're feeling down. In many cases, there's also language barriers, for example, to engage in hobbies, but then also to go to the doctor and understanding the health systems. Each health system also has their own different way of handling mental health. And, every time you move countries, you have to learn all of these things all over again at the same time that you're trying to remain competitive and productive and all these things. So this pressure is also then make us that prioritizing rest and prioritizing hobbies, at least for me, it was very hard for a long time, because I had this feeling I always have to be focusing on working and on being productive. Also, many of these aspects make it very hard for people to fit in, to make meaningful connections. We have this pressure to be functional. There's a number of recent papers, where people report things like being in the hospital and submitting papers because of this incredible pressure for us to just keep, publishing as if the rest of our life did not exist. And then, of course, in such environments, it's also hard to ask for help or even to show vulnerability, because there's this pressure that we have to put on this face that we're super professional, we're very smart, and we're doing great work, and so on. So showing vulnerability can be incredibly hard. And so that's kind of where I would like to move on to. How do we go from this individual struggles to start extending a bit to our environment? And asking for help is really not easy. And a big reason why it is not easy is that there's still a lot of stigma and discrimination of mentally ill people. So stigma refers to negative attitudes, beliefs, or stereotypes that people hold towards those that have some mental health condition. And the important thing is that stigma can be expressed kind of by others, but also people can self-stigmatize. So stigma can be things like people with depression are lazy, or me thinking, because I'm depressed and I can't get out of bed, I must be lazy, right? So that we can also ourselves kind of build these stereotypes and attitudes towards ourselves. And there's lots of studies that show that actually stigma prevents people from seeking help, for example, due to shame, guilt, and self-discrimination. Like, I don't deserve help because I'm not worth it, for example. And this means that stigma and the discrimination of mentally ill people places an extra burden on their condition and can actually contribute for their condition to become worse. So this is something that we really need to try to fight. Now, how can we fight stigma, right? And if we want to ask for help, this also means that we need to disclose our condition to some extent. And because of stigma, this disclosure can be really hard. Right. So if, for example, we disclose in the workplace that I had a panic attack when I was traveling to a conference, or that I've been depressed, and that's why I was on sick leave. So these things can, result in the least harmful case, so things like rumors or gossip. But some colleagues might, for example, start isolating us. Unfortunately, there are people that actively think they're in the right of bullying and harassing people that are mentally ill. But then there's other things that are maybe a bit more subtle, like that maybe the way our qualities are judged once we disclose our mental health condition might be evaluated in a different way. That, for example, people will notice much more every time I make a distraction error because I'm ADHD, for example. And so this also means that because of these biases, there might be reduced opportunities for leadership or for development, because people might start, kind of not wanting to engage with a person that they perceive to be weaker or less reliable or whatnot because of stigma. And of course, ultimately, this can result in job loss or unemployment of mentally ill people. Now, again, I don't think there are statistics for the academic world, but there are statistics for the rest of the world. And it is known that people with mental health problems have to apply for 38% more jobs than, this was a study in Norway. But anyway, so this is a pattern, so that people that are mentally ill have to apply much more to be invited for a job interview than people without mental health problems. And so I think this is a specific or a problem that is likely to be much worse in academia, also because the community is so small. If you disclose to your working group now that maybe is a safe place, everybody ultimately might know, and so it might be hard to find a job later on. But now what we also know is that actually disclosing mental health, mental illness can reduce stigma stress and can support the recovery. And so the question is, how do we go about it, right? So disclosing mental illness might help me recover. At the same time, I have potentially all these costs because the environment is stigmatizing me. And so disclosure, it's important to keep in mind that disclosure can happen at different levels, and you don't have to essentially spread the news to the whole world if you don't want to. And you can disclose, for example, only with your coworkers or only with your boss or the human resources. So disclosure can happen at multiple levels, going from social avoidance, where we try to completely avoid that anybody can even have a hint that we have a mental illness, all the way to broadcasting that we have a problem. And this is essentially what I'm doing now, right? But in between these two extremes, there's different levels where, for example, secrecy, you might participate in a self-help group, or you can attend some dedicated meetings at your institute, but you don't need to tell everybody around you. Selective disclosure, you might share with some of your colleagues that, for example, kind of friends in your institute, but not with your supervisors or with the rest of the department. And indiscriminate disclosure can be more like if people are talking about this over lunchtime and, they happen to say something about depression or anxiety or another condition, and then you could just talk about your own experience without having to feel like you need to advertise, but also that you don't have necessarily to hide. And so the important thing here is that there's pros and cons to each of these levels, and there's really no right answer. You need to measure your environment and try to see whether the pros in a given situation might overcome the cons. And for most of my career, I've been somewhere between the social avoidance and the selective disclosure. And only once I had a more stable position, because I had the privilege to do this, I kind of went to the levels of indiscriminate and broadcasting disclosure. There's an online workbook that it's essentially a program, but you can look at the workbook materials that kind of help understanding the different pros and cons and how to go about these decisions. And I'm also happy to talk about it later. So then I would like now to move on to how do we go from ourselves and maybe kind of our most immediate environment to start promoting change. Because going back to this graphic again, we see that it's not just about us. There's something about our environments that also seem to make us more prone to have a mental illness. And so I would start to talk about self-advocacy because, again, there are studies that show that advocating for what we need and negotiating and knowing our rights is something that also helps mentally ill people to feel empowered and also supports essentially their or our recovery. And so self-advocacy would include identifying and communicating our needs, setting boundaries, or after we identify the needs, trying to understand what are the boundaries that maybe I need to set in order to protect myself. And it can also include adjustments that can take many forms and can be like from very small ones to big ones. So, for example, changing the working environment. If you're in an office where you're continuously disrupted, then you find this very distracting and somehow also exhausting. Maybe you can move to a different office. Managing the workload, maybe, not working at 100% every day, but rather like maybe at 90, so that then when something extra comes up, you still have the capacity to manage it without being overloaded. Reshaping or reworking on responsibilities and expectations over a given time frame. So all of these things can be changed once we know what our needs are. And my experience has been that actually communicating what I needed was much more effective than saying, oh, I'm depressed and therefore I need something. So rather just explaining, I don't have a lot of energy at the moment. I'm finding it very hard to concentrate. And so I need, for example, 1 day of home office per week. So communicating and explaining the needs, because also, again, there's not a lot of knowledge about what a given diagnosis might mean, has been much more helpful. And so things that have worked for me over the years was a big click that I needed to have in my mind was that rest is work. So even if I would only care about being a productive person, which anyway, I don't think we should think about it in these terms, but even if productivity would be my single goal in life, rest is an integral part of, being creative, being not introducing bugs in my code, and so on and so on. So that rest is part of work somehow. Setting boundaries, for example, for me, I realized that if I work after 6 p.m., I will sleep very bad because I will be thinking about the problems. And so at some point, I also started to make this rule that beyond some exceptional meetings with international partners, I'm not working after 5:30, 6 p.m. I realized lunch breaks were incredibly draining. So, I stopped going to lunch in the canteen every day. Home office, implementing home office pre-COVID, this was not something that most people liked to offer, but to me, it was actually very helpful to have few home office days per week. And I realized I was much more balanced in positions where I could have my own routine, implement my own work style. How do I manage the different tasks that I have to do? From where do I work? At which times? And so on. And then an important aspect was once I got to this stage 3, right? So once things start to become very overwhelming, to reduce the workload pressure, trying to drop out of projects that, I got into because I was excited and I thought I had a lot of energy, and then turns out I didn't. So dropping out of projects that feel overwhelming or stressful. Also learning to say no to myself in a preventive way, right? So every time someone comes with an idea or I would like to do something, trying to put some breaks so that I don't get to this phase of being very overwhelmed. And then also deciding my own priorities. So who do I want to be as a scientist, right? So I could be writing a paper in this hour that I'm talking with you, but I prefer to be here. No, so because this is something that makes me much more happy and fulfilled as a scientist than simply having an H index of, 150 or something. And then an important thing was always to find some allies around me. So some people that I could talk with about these things and that I could try to seek help from. And then again, when I reached stage 3, getting professional help, going to the general doctor, having psychotherapy, and being on sick leave. All these things have been incredibly helpful. Now, defending our rights can be very challenging when we are already overwhelmed, right? So once we get to these maybe stage 3 or 4, it's almost impossible to engage in self-advocacy. So like when we're this tired or down, it might be impossible to self-advocate. And so what can we do? Well, people that have experience of mental illness, kind of past experience, can advocate for others, right? So at the moment, I can be here talking because I'm feeling good. But a year and a half ago, I would probably not be able to be giving this talk because I was struggling. But now I can, and maybe this can help some people. Even just being visible can help to break the stigma and, serve as a role model. Like for me, I had no senior scientist that I could look at and see, oh, they have struggled in the past and they're still, successful scientists. And somehow not having these role models made me feel very, very isolated and very lonely for a long time. So knowing that you can struggle and you can still be a happy scientist or a fulfilled scientist, it's also important. And again, even if you have no story of mental illness, you can support your colleagues. You can try to learn and kind of try to support them in the best way that you can. So even if you have no history of mental illness, you can actually save lives with very tiny actions. And sometimes even just listening to people can make a huge, huge change. For advisors, I have some slides later on this, but of course, you should be willing to listen, but then also try to do something about it. Like think about what accommodations might support the person to, manage their life and work in a way that, they can get out and recover from what they're going through. And then there's many other places where you can help by, as a PhD or postdoc representative. There's EDI committees, workers' councils. You can establish support groups or discussion spaces, right? Or even just having like a Thursday tea where you talk about feelings can make a big difference. And then, of course, raising awareness and visibility. So I would like to, for example, highlight some of the things that we're doing at EGU. So the ECS group has a work-life balance group. There's a recently established neurodiversity group. If you want to join, please drop me an email. We had a debate or a union symposium last year at EGU. It's still online, so where we talked about stigma and opening up about mental health problems across different career stages. And for EGU 26, there's, for example, a short course on how to navigate the conference as a neurodivergent participant. So there's actually quite a lot going on at EGU, and I think it's very good. And feel free to also propose more activities if you have the energy and the capacity to. So how can you become an ally? Important things to not do is to generalize, to assign value to the conditions and to rely on stereotypes. Also, don't diagnose others because, again, that's not our role. If we're not medical professionals, it's, we're not qualified to do this. Also, giving advice if it's not requested or judging people based on your experiences is also very, very unhelpful, as it is also to make assumptions about what people can do or what people need, right? So there's often the thing that if people think, if I can do this or if I have been depressed and I was able to do that, then everybody can. So don't generalize. And also very important, don't force people to talk about their problems or to seek support, right? So people have to want to, go to the doctor. And of course, it's challenging, but you can't force people to seek support. What you can do, you can try to learn about the different conditions and the variations in these conditions. Even if you don't understand them, you can still be open to try to learn and give space for people to communicate particular needs that could help them to manage their condition. Also respect the people's boundaries and preferences, even if you don't agree with them. And, even if you also don't understand why some people might not be recharged going to a social event in the evening, or why people might not be recharged going for lunch every day to the canteen, right? So just respect whatever people feel like that they need to do to cope with or to kind of to feel well. You can't force people to seek support, but you can offer help, right? You can, for example, offer to make a phone call or offer to go with the person to the doctor if this helps them. And you can also consider to take training. right? So there's, for example, mental health first aid, and there's many other trainings that you can also attend. So I know I'm already kind of pushing a bit on time. I have a few more slides on this diversity and inclusion aspect, and I think I probably will be able to be on time. We have seen that, again, in this graph, that we see that underrepresented groups, in this case gender, have higher prevalence of depression and anxiety. And so I would like to talk about a number of reasons why that might be. And again, I'm not doing research on the topic, but it's kind of from the things that I've observed over time. Well, we know that the academic system is not diverse at all, right? And there's this concept of the pipeline being leaky, and we talked about it in the previous webinar where Davide was here. And I really dislike this concept of the leaky pipeline because it's not a passive thing. So the path is more like this hurdle race where we're constantly having underrepresented groups are constantly having to jump over stones or to jump over given hurdles. And we know that this is also not just a women problem, it's a problem of other underrepresented groups in academia. And I really like this blog post from Ingrid Arnell from a few years ago, where she talks about this I think she doesn't call them microaggressions, but this little hurdles that, we will not be able to complain to the HR or to the equal opportunity officers, right? So we cannot complain about not being invited to a meeting, not being added to an email of where some important discussion was being had, not cited by our colleagues, even though our paper might be much more relevant than the other ones that are cited, and so on, right? So there's this thing that women are permanently being forgotten, consciously or unconsciously discriminated against. And this, of course, creates this permanent stress that you can imagine what it does to the well-being of a person that has to deal with this on a daily basis. In addition to this, we also know that women, there's this public publishing gap where, for example, in the geosciences, there's this study for the EGU journals, where even though women make up more or less 50 to 30% of early career scientists, in these journals, women make only about 20% of the authors in published papers, right? So clearly women are being less involved in publications compared to their presence in academia. So again, this creates an additional burden that people feel that there's no space to participate in our community, that we're not recognized by our contributions. And then there's a third axis, which is when it comes to promotions and evaluating excellence and evaluating the quality of the things that we do. There's also studies showing that underrepresented groups, so beyond women, also racial minorities and so on, that underrepresented groups are much more harshly evaluated, especially for those that have lower H indexes. And then keep in mind, women are also publishing less and kind of being less involved in papers, and they also have to spend more time dealing with all these micro stressors in the day-to-day life, right? So there's this, what I call a triple burden of underrepresented groups that naturally places much more stress in every single minute that we're living as academics. And this is a problem of academia, and also not just for the people, but also for the way we do science, because there's also studies that show that diverse groups are better at solving problems, for example, not just in academia, but also in other contexts. And so if we think about, for example, some problem of pollution, and we have people from different backgrounds, people will be asking different questions and will be having different tools to address the problem. For example, Temple Grandin she's a professor for animal sciences in Colorado State University. And in this case, she said autism helped her to understand animals because as an autistic scientist, she thinks in pictures, and that's probably closer to what animals do, right? So this diversity, having these type of voices in the way we do science can actually help us to address problems in more creative and innovative ways. And so this is the last point, that that I want to make is if we agree that diversity is important to make better science, and the lack of diversity in the current academic system is bad for us to do better science, but is also placing a burden on the people that are actually doing science, then we need to try to change the whole environment rather than, giving people tips on how to cope with stress. And so we can only do this if we try to build workplaces that are inclusive from the root and that are inclusive for all and not just for women or not just from racial minorities or not just for neurodivergent people, right? So that we can think about measures and environments that are just inclusive for everybody. And there's also this studies that show that if your environment is inclusive for minorities, also other people that are not minorities will benefit from them. And so there are different frameworks of kind of inclusive workspaces. I like this Canary Code principles by Ludmila Pavlova because she compares the canaries, so the neurodivergent people in work groups, as canaries in the coal mine, that they essentially are very sensitive to harmful environments and can kind of work as a sign of toxic or unhealthy environments. And so there's different principles that should be that can be followed. So participation, that everyone's perspectives be heard, that we try to break hierarchical barriers and develop shared agency, that we all contribute to the group's success. Focusing on outcomes instead of performative activities like showing up just to be seen or asking a question just to show that you're asking a question, and rather focusing on goals and autonomy of people and allow people to reach their goals in the way that they find best. Promote flexible work practices in terms of schedules, means of communication. Do you prefer verbal feedback or written feedback? Do you prefer to work alone or in groups and so on? So not force everybody to do things in the same way. Clear communication, so transparency in all the work processes, communicating clearly, and also by communicating clearly and having transparent procedures, this also allows to level the playing field in which not some people will have access to privileged information, for example, or benefit from certain things that others don't, and we don't even know about it. So this links also to organizational justice, so being fair in terms of all the processes like hiring, promotion, and so on. Who do we choose to invite and give visibility to? Who gets information about new grants or new proposals and all these things? So having processes that are just fair across the board for everybody, and then also have decisions that follow clear criteria that are transparently communicated and are unbiased. And so hopefully this helps to create environments that are more inclusive and that are more inclusive for everybody. So maybe to just wrap up now, what can you do to support or to create such inclusive environments? You can do something as an early career scientist, right? So for a while, I always felt like very powerless somehow. But as an early career scientist, you can, know and defend your rights. For example, working rights, that, we have a certain work schedule and we can defend that we're not forced to work over healthy limits. You can take representative roles to advocate for change, to advocate for others, and so on, and to also promote positive working environments. And something that I think as an early career we're normally not aware of is that we can also choose not to work in toxic environments. And my hope is that if everybody would choose not to do so and would choose positive environments, that then we would be able to promote change at a larger scale. And then you can also engage in training and learning. Right. So in the future, you will become a leader, probably. And so if you engage in training and learning early on, you will be better prepared to promote change once you get there. So as a team lead, there's a lot that I could say about this, but I think the first thing is really training and learning. And this is something that is not seen as relevant for many people, again, because of the pressure to just publish and get grants and so on. But training and learning how to be a mentor is really important. Team leads are role models, whether we like it or not. And so in that sense, we have to be very wise about how we go about our life, right? So if I keep saying that I've been working on the weekend and that I'm working during my vacations and whatnot, the standards that I'm setting to my group are very different than if I say, look, I'm not going to answer emails when I'm on vacation. And, that's it. I'm protecting my time. This puts very different levels of pressure on the people that we're responsible for. Be a mentor more than a supervisor. So, try to support each person's needs. Where do they want to go? How do you help them to get there rather than, essentially giving top-down orders. And a thing that I think is very important is leading through empathy and vulnerability. So showing vulnerability is very helpful because once a leader shows vulnerability, everybody else feels that they have the right and the space to also be vulnerable. And with this, I would like to thank Becky, Getachew, Silvia, and Elsa for organizing. And I'm a bit over my time, so I will answer questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna. I know that's slightly over what you wanted, but that was so much information. And I guess I just wanted to quickly say thank you as well for just being so open and honest and being that role model for so many people watching that you probably didn't have. So, but yeah, I guess you're happy to stay and answer some questions. Just to say to the audience as well, if a question is particularly important, if you upvote it, then I'll prioritize these questions that have the most. So to begin with, it says, I would think that mental health issues in academia are more prevalent amongst early career scientists. How can senior researchers recognise the signs and support their students and postdocs who are struggling with depression, anxiety, etc.?
Yeah, so I think the question came a bit before my last slides. So research leads have the duty, I think, so we have the duty to be trained to support people struggling because, again, the statistics show that for example, 60% of people will experience a mental health problem in their lifetime. So if we are aware of this, then this means that we have a huge responsibility to be trained into how to deal with this. And so for me, like the first step would be to force, maybe it's too strong, but to strongly encourage everyone that has responsibilities of, dealing with people that they have training and that they know mental health first training, right? Like how to deal with a crisis. That's maybe kind of the first, very urgent, but then also like positive leadership, unconscious bias training, how to kind of manage people in a way that protects mental health and that supports also people to be more on this preventive side than to be on this response side. So I think training is a very important thing.
That's well answered. Okay, next one. How can one distinguish between a real lack of knowledge / experience and an apparent feeling that one may not be suitable for academia, in brackets, imposter syndrome? I guess that's a big question.
That's very hard because, throughout my career, I've always thought I will open a tea house or a cat hotel or, so I've gone through the same thing for most of my career. And I guess two things. So it helps to have a mentor, a mentor does not have to be your direct advisor, for example. And in my case, it was my master's thesis supervisor that I have not, collaborated with him any time since, I don't know, many, many years. But when I was struggling and I was considering dropping academia and dropping everything, I would give him a call and then he would kind of just encourage me and say like, no, you are a scientist somehow, no? So, and try to stay. No, it just gave me a bit this encouragement that, I was not an imposter. And I mean, for me, it's still hard to say this because I still feel like an imposter even now, right? So, but anyway, he seemed to think not, and that kind of helped me to, stay. And then maybe the second thing is, do you have fun and do you enjoy doing science? Because for me, it's like, it is sometimes I think it's a bit like a toxic relationship somehow. But in the end of the day, when I have these good times when you're analyzing data or you go to a conference and you're discussing ideas with people and this just gives you this positive boost, then I think it's a sign that it's maybe still worth trying to stay, but maybe search for another lab. Or right, like just search for a different environment where you can feel supported and where you can thrive.
Yeah. And there's a question that's kind of linked to this, I suppose. It says that often students specifically maybe, but I guess this is probably links to all academia, is not feeling good enough and that they're not working hard enough. And how can this problem be solved?
I think that's a misconception. The times that I did my best work were the times after my sick leaves, actually, where I was not working hard enough. But because I was not working hard enough, I had time to think and to be creative. So, of course, I'm not recommending to go on sick leave, with burnout. But the point being that I think this is a misconception that we work better by working more. And we can deconstruct this misconception.
Yeah, and links, I guess, what you said in your talk about prioritizing rest and rest is work, right? And having that mindset.
Maybe
I
a
guess.
comment on this. I remember when I started building hobbies into my routine, I remember thinking, oh, suddenly it feels like I have more time in the day just because I had more energy and I was happier. Right. So,
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. Just to say it is 1 minute past 5. Are you happy to continue
I
for
could
a
say a
little
little
bit?
bit more if there's still some questions.
Okay, some of these quite similar, so I'm trying to see. So one says that as an early career scientist, they feel anxious about the enormous pressure put on by the current academic system that publish or perish, for example, is significantly impacting my mental health. At the same time, I feel powerless to fight a system that has been running like this forever. Any advice?
I think we're all there somehow. And I think, as I mentioned in some of the slides, there are places where you can act as an early career scientist, right? So, for example, as representative of PhD students or these kind of organs, you can decide, for example, what are PhD thesis requirements. They're very different between universities and between countries. So even this concept of that we have to publish a lot during our PhD is very different between countries, right? And this is something that people can have a direct impact on if they go to their university or their faculty and try to promote some change on the criteria that you need to fulfill to get a degree. Of course, the bigger thing is much harder to change. And I think the only way we can change is by taking these tiny steps. No, we meet here and we talk about it. And there's going to be a union symposium at EGU 26 where we will be talking about scientific excellence and career paths. So connecting to people, building a network, and not thinking that we have to do it all by ourselves and that we have to do it all from today to tomorrow. I mean, of course, it would be wonderful if we could change things overnight, but that's not realistic. But we can at least take every day a step in that direction.
Yeah, maybe optimistic, but it does feel like people are trying to push things in the right direction, right? So, and then there's one that says, do you have any advice for someone who has tried different strategies but still feels like the toxic academic environment is harming their mental health? Like, for example, like when is it time to stop fighting and start searching for another healthier career path?
I think there's also this misconception that you can only do science being in academia, right? So there's so many science-related jobs in agencies, for example. I mean, ESA or environmental agencies or local governmental city agencies, being kind of scientific project coordinators. And so there's many other roles that I still think are fundamental to science, but somehow are looked down upon. No, so that if people decide to take some of these paths, that they're considered to be lost to academia, and I think that, or to be lost to science, and that's for sure not true, right? And I have many friends that did decide to leave precisely because of these reasons, and they are still doing science. They're analyzing data. They're trying to get learning something out of the data to inform policymakers or to inform companies on how to do X or Y. So you can still do science. If you don't find a positive working environment, maybe you could have a try, and there's no shame, and there's like no problem in just leaving the system. Although I'm always very angry when people drop out because they feel like they're forced to and not because they're motivated to do something else.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we have one more that's quite highly upvoted. So it says it's about saying they were surprised about the high gender disparity with regards to rates of depression and wondered how much cultural gender norms affect these numbers. And then how do you think we could break down these gender barriers when talking and advocating about mental health?
Yeah, so that's why I know I was a bit long, and so maybe the last slides didn't come through anymore because the attention span was down. But it's precisely I think this gender norms and the discrimination that women and other groups face in society end up translating into much more pressure to be productive or to function like in a normal way, or to, and this pressure is like happening every minute of your day. So this blog post now on the molehills, that is like every day it might happen that someone cuts you when you're talking and they speak over you, or they ignore what you just said, or they're not inviting you to some meeting where they're going to discuss how to organize the next project for whatever call. So all these things, right? So all these gender norms, or women, or other groups are not seen and are not considered in equal stands. This adds a huge amount of pressure on the daily life. Put this on top of being less cited, being less often invited to contribute to studies, and this negative evaluation, kind of higher negative evaluation rates that I mentioned. And also, so my feeling for a long time as a Portuguese woman that turns out I'm also neurodivergent was that I had to run like 10 times more or faster than everybody else. And so, of course, there's no wonder, that I ended up in burnout every few years, because you just feel this pressure. And, and so the cultural norms will not disappear overnight as well, but at least we could try to build the academic system in a way that you mitigate some of these biases.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer. I'm looking through, I think a lot of these have been addressed in your talk. Like you said, a lot of the questions were kind of asked throughout, and then you did address some of them in later slides, or we've kind of addressed the majority of them. So maybe we should wrap it up there, if you're happy with that.
Thanks a lot for the invitation and for organizing again. So just having the space to talk is really important.
Yeah, and I think that's always things like this advocate for this. This is an example of things you can do. And there's also people saying how much they've enjoyed this talk as well, just so you can, if you're not seeing that. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day and your life to give this for us. So yeah, thank you very much. And also someone also asked, so this will be recorded and it's going to be up and available on the EGU YouTube channel in a couple of weeks, so you can share with people that you think might be interested. So yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you everyone.